But with that, that's about it for today. We're gonna be delving into just what the hell is going on with the 9. So stay tuned for that, I suppose.
I lied.
For the record, the script for my previous video was written before the release of Act 2. I'll still be talking about the 9 eventually, when there's more information to talk about, but I think for now we have a bit more of a pressing matter. In my last video, I was hyping up the Winnower, playing some part in the events playing out in Heresy. You should totally go watch that, by the way. There's some pretty fun stuff in there. I still believe he does to some degree, but I don't believe he's the immediate antagonistic force we need to worry about. I'm sure you've seen other content creators talk about it. There seems to be some new presence within the deep. The Court of Blades will occasionally open with these lines, which I'll just play back to back.
We are not alone in the deep. Something I cannot see stands between the Winnower and the Taken. Carve these offerings free from their weakness, King, before something else does. I know the wills of every knife in this realm. I hear them scream as the strong metastasize the weak. And I feel a strength I do not know, carving paths that should belong to the Winnower, but don't.
Now, it's very easy and somewhat reasonable to assume that whatever this new entity is working against the Winnower. However, I don't think that this is the case. If an entity were strong enough to hold control over the Ascendant Realm to that degree, I imagine that, due to its philosophy, this behavior would actually be encouraged by the Winnower. So, I think that what this entails is that the Winnower has some sort of new enforcer that's not just controlling the Taken, but making brand new Taken. For those unaware, if you take a closer look at the Dire Taken, they use Destiny 2 models, unlike the ordinary Taken, which use models from the Destiny 1 versions of enemies. This means two things: that these Taken are freshly, took, I guess? And that whatever this new threat is, it has been taking en masse. I haven't seen many people talk about it, but an entire new subtype of enemies of this degree has never been seen within a season or episode. This is on par with getting a new enemy variant for an expansion. In fact, it's an even bigger change than most of what we've seen in recent years, with the Dread being the main exception. Every Dire Taken has powers that are swapped around and utilized in different ways, with some even using Strand, which has not been seen beforehand. Point being, if we're getting enemy variants this radically different in a season, then they must be pretty important. Alongside the Dire Taken, we've been seeing a new phenomenon with both them and the Ascendant Plane, in excess of strange tendrils and the... While the answer that initially seemed likely was that these were in some way involved with the Winnower, these eyes and tendrils definitely seem to be something different. Which, on a personal note, I'm fine with. I think the Winnower would be a lot more subtle of an eldritch horror than a mass of giant tentacles. Anyways, this new form of Taken corruption is seen all over the place in Heresy. They're linked with the Aversion Anchors, and they show up on both the Dreadnought and within various different arenas in the Court of Blades. I mean, just take a gander all around you when you're in the Ascendant Plane and the Nether activity. This new corruption is everywhere. Now, as for what this new threat is, I've seen, and I will address a few of the various theories that I believe are worth mentioning, and how much validity I think they hold. Toland, the Shattered. While conceptually, Toland taking control of the Taken would certainly be interesting, especially due in part to his anger with us upon not initially upholding the mantle of Taken King after killing Oryx, whatever this new threat is seems far too powerful for it to be Toland, unless Brother has been on the grind off screen and locked the fuck in. If you remember, Toland's throne world is basically just a tiny little spit of land. Meanwhile, this new threat is supposedly carving its way through the very Ascendant Plane itself. So no, I don't think it's Toland. Some sort of remnant of Akka. While this idea could sort of fit, given the nature of the episode, in the lore tab for the Endling Seek Sparrow, it mentions Asa calling out to Akka's remains, and Akka doesn't respond. I think that's pretty cut and dry. Some sort of remnant of Rolk. Bife mentioned that this was a theory he saw in his most recent video, and no. Of all the ones we've mentioned so far, this makes the least amount of sense to me. To get a bit opinionated, I think if they brought back Rolk, it would be for shallow fan service and not much else. Teox.
No!
No. Teox is either incredibly dead or in some sort of stasis. If she is still around, I imagine she's starting to look like Mr. House by now. An as of yet unknown worm god, or proto-worm. While this idea could make some sense, I don't really buy this one either. Unless there's some particularly juiced worm god out there we don't know about, the worm gods are not on the level that this new threat is being described as. Nezarec. The culprit being Nezarec is one of the more interesting theories in my opinion, with Nezarec's spirit, I guess, still being around and unaccounted for. It'd be interesting to see him step up and try to make some sort of strategic grasp for power. An interesting thing to note in regards to Nezarec is that the debuff you get from looking at the giant eyes is overwhelming terror. Sounds very Nezarec-y. For the most part, while I think it's a lot more possible than some of the others, I still have my doubts about it being Nezarec. And on a personal note, I so badly want them to do something else with Nezarec, as the way he was ham-fisted in Delightfall was absolutely horrendous, and his inclusion in Revenant felt kind of pointless, at least to me. Nezarec is a character with a lot of potential, and I hope that potential eventually gets realized. The Nine. This is the second most likely theory, in my opinion. We know from both the Curios of the Nine that we've been receiving from the seasonal challenges every week, along with the Rite of the Nine event being revealed in the Act 2 stream, that they're going to have some sort of involvement in the story down the road. The Heretical Sidearm has a lore tab that talks about what's going on with the Nine currently. I plan on discussing the Nine more on their own once we get more information about them, so I'll read said lore tab when the time comes. But to put it simply, the Nine are not content with their current existence. If one or more of them split apart and somehow manage to find a way to gain independence from Life and Sol, there's no telling what they do after that. Not to mention, they seem to already have some sort of control over the Taken themselves, so it wouldn't be completely out of the picture for them to find out how to make their own. But while there's evidence that could point to them being the culprit, I think there's one big thing that puts the idea to rest. That being that, as far as we know at the moment, the Nine need Life and Soul to exist in order for they themselves to exist. Why would they send a Taken army out to fuck with us if that's the case? Unless we get more information that points to them having gained independence from Life and Soul, this theory will have to be put on the back burner, which leads us to what I feel is the most likely theory. The new threat is something completely new. Hearing those words that may sound like a complete cop-out, as that's the easiest thing you can devise. But, as a matter of fact, I happen to have my own crackpot theory as to what this new threat could be. But before we get into it, keep in mind that I am fully aware that this theory is an absolute long shot, and I'm just sharing it for fun. Take everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt. As I'm sure you've heard mentioned before, a lore book from Echoes, Polyphony, mentions a really odd, almost out-of-place entity in one of its lore tabs. Here's an excerpt from that lore tab. The great quiet thing, the knotworm, kept its eyes closed and ignored the call. It was still too soon, it decided. It shivered, the motion forming cascading bubbles of new, hypothetical simulations in which it did not shiver. These contradictions soured and burst, scattering nutrients into the network. A knotworm, huh? Doesn't that description sound oddly specific? And check out this lore tab from the Endling Seek Exotic Sparrow. We still hope to see another. What do you call someone who is blood of your blood, inheritor of a similar ancient lineage yet deeply changed, whom you have never known dearly, in fact, barely at all, but whose echoes you see in the still pond, the polished glass? Asa settles for cousin. Ire, Yule, Zol, Akka, dead Akka, whose averted bones circle Saturn in twin orbit with Titan, where Asa dreams. Of all the cousin names, it is that one that catches Asa, rolls along her flukes and shivers, rippling in the methane dream. There is some mirror where Asa is the ship, Akka the refugee, an accident of parentage. One sibling this river, the other that stream. And so, how does Asa hate what she nearly was? Cousin bones, family bones, swimming as she does. In her marrow, she knows this. She is lucky. Dead Akka hums, and Asa feels it stem to stern. She stirs from her dream to roll as she listens. A long stretch of blade's edge, crystal, parchment, and the breath of the galaxy along her flank. Asa hums back, of course. She can't help herself, even knowing better. Your cousin calls out, "I am here. Is anyone there?" And you answer. You answer. Dead Akka does not answer. It is a ghost firing of bone neurons. Zol does not answer. Zeta and Cell and Aura and Lise do not answer. Some glutted, war-fed cousin, long across the sea of screams, calls out, a distant worm-song threat. Asa goes quiet, remembers all at once, presses her consciousness close to her Titan, settles back into a softer, subtler dream. In that dream, Asa is not the last. Now, I'll admit, I completely forgot about the lore book from Echoes, as I try to pretend that episode just doesn't exist, until Byth mentioned it in a recent video of his. Admittedly, the first third of this comes from him, but him reminding me of the knotworm thing made something click in my brain. I remember watching a video around the time of Echoes that didn't get too much attention. A video titled The Knotworm Theory, uploaded by Taco3D. I think that's how it's pronounced. Take note of how this knotworm is initially described. That great, quiet thing. This description, interestingly enough, is capitalized. Now, take a look back at Heresy. Whatever this new thread is, it is very consistently described as being quiet. And where before have we heard of an entity prominently described as quiet? The Mask of the Quiet One. So, let's take a brief look at the helmet itself. Firstly, let's go over the lore tab. Must you all be so dark? You're too focused on the horns. Look, I have died hundreds of times hunting the shadowed killers in Murder Row. I have spent years mulling over Toland's and Osiris's discourse on Thanatonautics. I have dabbled a bit myself and saw what lingers immediately upon all death. What I have done is found a way to channel the void and draw that essence in before it is lost to the ether, to return it to light so it can be properly bestowed back on our enemies. Death does not have to be final. It can, in fact, be recycled. What's so dark about that? Satomi, architect of the mask. Very interesting lore tab, this one. I think the most notable thing about this helmet is that, according to this Satomi character, it seems to have been constructed to use the void to recycle death, and the Thanatonautics are mentioned. For any new-gen Destiny fans who may not know, or those who have simply forgotten, Thanatonautics is a practice amongst Guardians, specifically Warlocks, where they purposefully kill themselves in order to receive visions. As for Satomi herself, the character is only ever mentioned in 2 pieces of lore. The lore tab for this helmet, and one little bit from the Mementos of the Wild, which, if I remember correctly, were the little pieces of lore you'd find in Cage stashes from Destiny 2 Year 1. It's been a while, man. Ugh. And for one more notable thing, let's take a gander at the helmet's exotic perk, which was actually recently changed. Dreaded Visage grants ability energy when you are damaged, while you have a Void Super equipped. Rapid Final Blows and Final Blows while critically wounded grant Devour, an exotic in which you benefit from taking damage and gives you Devour when wounded if you have a Void Super equipped. In other words, an exotic which makes you stronger when you're in pain. Now that, combined with the Void aspect, sounds very, very Nezarec-esque. But let me show you something hardly anyone talks about anymore. A piece of lore from all the way back in the Taken King's April update. A lore tab which I'm sure many of you have forgotten about. Psylocke, the Defiled. Mind scan of Subject 667, known as Psylocke the Defiled. Data script 1245.5. Stasis is online, initiating 8th attempt to probe Mindscape.
It'll work this time. I've mapped every synapse.
Sure you did.
There, did you see that? A flare of neural activity. Stimulate the region.
I can feel you.
This will never work. We should either bring in a witch or put him out of his misery.
Hey, Petra said she needs this data. Don't ask me why.
I know you're here. Your light is dim. But there are other things to feed the worm that hungers.
There. Did you hear that?
Hear what?
Poking around in my head. Poking and prodding at my emptiness.
That?
No purpose without.
You're reading that, right?
You're being too gentle.
He's playing with us.
You'll learn nothing this way.
He's in stasis. He doesn't even know we're here.
A nightmare.
He knows.
He doesn't. I'll prove it.
Oh please, oh please, oh please.
Probe the memory region again and isolate all synapses correlating with pain and trauma.
By the light, do you see?
Give him a jolt. That did the trick.
Is he happy?
Glorious pain!
Memory synapses are firing.
Finally. Let's see what we've... Whoa, what is that?
Blessed is the Nazareth. Am I strong enough for X? Is it time?
It's too much. It's overloading.
More.
Shut it off.
More. Give me more.
said shut it!
Crackling noise, followed by 5.5 minutes of silence.
The greater the anguish, the greater the reward. I know you. See your thoughts. I will use the pain. Reach in. Give me the pain. Take away all but agony. Through it, I transcend. Just once more.
Silence for 20 minutes.
Huh? What? Lost my train of thought. Ready to begin.
Stasis is online, initiating, 9th attempt to probe Mindscape?
It'll work this time. I've mapped every synapse.
Sure you did. This Grimoire entry, to me at least, is incredibly intriguing for multiple reasons. Not only is the name Nazareth incredibly similar to Nezarec, but they both seem to have some sort of ties to pain. However, unlike Nezarec, who simply feeds off of pain as a form of sustenance, this Nazareth entity, much like the Mask of the Quiet One itself, seems to provide a sort of benefit or power from pain. If we were to link it back to the Mask of the Quiet One, however, I think this entity feeds off of death in some way. This quiet entity recycles death into power, much like the mask itself. And linking this all back to heresy, let's take another look back at these dire taken. What exactly is the definition of dire? Well, according to dictionary.com, one of the definitions of dire is causing or involving great fear or suffering. I believe the implications of this to be that the dire taken are likely in constant pain, but are being empowered by said pain, thus giving them the newer, more potent powers they possess. And remember that one line from Oryx?
And I feel a strength I do not know, carving paths that should belong to the winnower, but don't.
What if when Oryx says that this entity is carving out paths that should belong to the winnower, what he really means is that this entity is beginning to take a domain over death? With the winnower being brought up, I also don't believe that whatever this entity is trying to, nor could it, overtake the winnower. Remember the winnower's philosophy and the greater doctrine of the sword logic. If this entity is strong enough to gain dominance over the entirety of the Ascendant Plane, the winnower would be utterly ecstatic. All this being is doing is further proving his logic correct. So, to conclude this little theory of mine, what specifically is this entity? The Quiet One, the Not Worm, the Nazareth? Well, remember that one warlock aspect, the child of the old gods? I believe that both Nazareth and Nezarec are more than likely the old gods in question. I believe that whatever this Quiet One is, it's the same species or type of entity as Nezarec. Perhaps they're part of the same pantheon of these old gods. Maybe there's more, who knows? I guess instead of being the final god of pain, he'd be the final god of death. And another quick thing I just thought of is the fact that the Taken essentially manifested this entity into existence. It's at least implied. So if it's this pre-existing ancient god-like entity, how would that happen in the first place? Well, if you remember that awful Nezarec Pantheon Twab lore entry, it implies that Nezarec's body is artificially made, using a blueprint of Rolk's. That's at least how they describe it. But I think the implication could be that if Nezarec needed an artificially made body, then perhaps this other entity, this Nazareth guy, was formless until the Taken manifested it into existence, into physical existence. For the most part, though, that's kind of the best I got at the moment. And remember that this is all pure speculation and it's all in good fun. All of what I just said could very well be nothing, and this entity could truly be something completely, totally new, with no current hints from previous lore. Whatever this mysterious entity ends up being, I'm sure the frontiers of the future will hold the answer.
Ultra Risen, thank you for the $2 donation. Can I feed the Echo of Navigation motor oil? I imagine probably not. Then again, what do you feed your GPS?